Good afternoon, and welcome to another one of our Exeter Institutogram conversations with me, Sajjad Rizvi, from the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. Today I will be in conversation with Supriya Gandhi from Yale University about her new book, which is published by Harvard, The Emperor Who Never Was, and it's about Dara Shukoh, and there she is. And we'll be talking about her book and her work and the significance of the Mughal inheritance for contemporary South Asia. Just waiting for her to come in. Should be just a second. Hi, Supriya.
Wonderful. Yeah. Glad this works.
Yeah, no, it should work. It usually does work. So welcome to the conversation. Very much looking forward to it, and I'm sure many others are. I just did a very brief introduction, just saying who you were and mentioning the book. And as we often do in these conversations, I thought we'll start by just asking you to say something about why it was that you came to write this book.
Okay, thank you, Sajjad. So for a long time, when I was in graduate school doing my PhD, I was trying to steer away from working on Dara Shukoh.
Right.
Partly because, I thought he's so well known. What's the point of writing about him? And in any case, wasn't he just this naive mystic with his head in the clouds, as people said he was? Don't we already know all there is to know about him?
Yeah.
But then, as time went by, because I was getting increasingly quite interested in these Sanskrit-Persian intellectual exchanges, I found that it was really hard to avoid Dara Shukoh.
Yeah.
And I also found increasingly that it was very hard also to tear Dara Shukoh away from ideas of Mughal sovereignty. That he wasn't just this outlier or this misfit. If one wanted to study this phenomenon, he was a really important piece of the puzzle. And someone was also interested in looking at what Hindus reading and writing in Persian were interested in. I found that Dara Shukoh's writings circulated really extensively after his death. So they were influential. He himself was killed. He never got to be a ruler. But his own writings tended to have a great deal of importance for Hindus employed in the Mughal state. So then I reluctantly started, and then once I started, I found that there was really a lot more to be said about him.
Sure. I mean, I guess in terms of the basic kind of historical narratives that are out there on the Mughal period, I mean, I remember someone a while ago commenting that no one's really written the biography of either a Mughal ruler or a Mughal prince for a very long time, and then suddenly we seem to have people who, like yourself, coming around to this and thinking that actually maybe these rulers, maybe these sovereigns and their networks actually do need to be reassessed, and perhaps the study of Mughal India has gone a bit too far in one particular kind of direction before that, where it has been very much dominated by the study of different types of structures, and not necessarily by ideas and individuals associated with those ideas.
Right. And I think, both are important. And actually, I found that, the narrative form lends itself to looking very closely, of course, at a particular person, as well as to sort of gesturing at broader structures and processes also. So I think there's really place for navigating, both these approaches.
Yeah, and that's very, noticeable that you did take this narrative approach in this book. But of course, along the way, there are many very interesting discussions, especially the one that you raised, which is this sort of what's now in this project known as the Perso-Indica aspect of it. You know, the translation of Sanskrit works into Persian, and that wider kind of cultural idea which is going on in the Mughal period, particularly in the 17th century.
Right. And of course, that's what Dara Shukoh is most famous for, his engagement with Indic thought, his translations from Sanskrit, working in collaboration with Sanskrit Pandits. And yet, that really is only one section of his intellectual and spiritual output. You know, he had numerous Sufi writings, and the advantage of sort of taking one figure like this and looking at what he's writing against the backdrop of his times enables one to really see his intellectual trajectory. And there's a remarkable amount of context that one can provide. You know, there's a lot that we don't know, but there's a fair bit of context that we can provide when it comes to Dara Shukoh. You know, his engagement with Pandits, for instance, his relationship with Kavindra Saraswati.
Yes, which we discussed.
Piece together through looking. That's right. You know, through looking at the number of times he gets awarded, you know, various handsome sums of money by Shah Jahan, and the years in which he was in attendance at the court. Yeah.
I mean, there's one small question which I have, which I've often thought about, but I don't know if you, to be honest, I don't know if you discussed this or if you have looked into this, but it's the connection, if there is one at all, with Mir Fenderisky, because we do know that Mir Fenderisky had an audience with Shah Jahan at least twice, the last one being, I believe, in the mid-1630s. And do you know if there's any evidence that he might have met Dara Shukoh, or Dara Shukoh might have met him? And,
you know, so that's something that I've been very intrigued by, because I didn't find anything conclusive. This is when Dara Shukoh was still fairly young, and he was just getting to become acquainted with his Sufi masters. So I didn't find it. Now, you know, it doesn't mean that these things don't exist. You know, I'm still finding sort of interesting things connected with Jahanara, for instance. But so it's hard to determine what direct influence Mir Fenderisky might have had on Dara Shukoh, or on people in his circle.
I mean, I guess for most people who may have come across this book, and particularly if you place it alongside Audrey Trishka's recent book on Aurangzeb, they'd probably be thinking very much in terms of a presentist, contemporary South Asia perspective on this, where people tend to look at the Mughal inheritance in terms of this kind of choice between Dara Shukoh and Aurangzeb, as a way in which one manages relations between communities and ideas and religion and power, perhaps. You must have, of course, been aware of this, and it's quite clear when you talk about some of the, you mentioned, for example, Moth Smoke and Daira, and plays on Dara Shukoh. I mean, how did you want to address that sort of current obsession with this very binary choice between Dara Shukoh and Aurangzeb?
Well, I wanted to, of course, identify it and lay it out, and then move away from it, insofar as, you know, one really can sort of be unshackled, not completely be unshackled from the present. But I found that these narratives about Dara and Aurangzeb, whether one is on the side of Aurangzeb, one believes that he was this zealous Muslim who, you know, brought the Muslims of the subcontinent onto the right path and stamped out heresy, or whether one believes that Dara Shukoh really is a liberal model for for our present, that all of these narratives rely on the sort of mythification of Dara and Aurangzeb. Not so much, in terms of, that there are these false facts circulated about them, but in the sense that these are very much living figures. They live amongst us. You just need to mention Dara Shukoh and you get, or Aurangzeb, of course, larger, and you get an immediate reaction from somebody, as I myself have discovered, in the audience of the book. So these are figures whom we think we know, and I wanted to actually disturb that a little bit, because there's a lot of textual story that really actually isn't very well known. And that partly feeds into why I decided to write this as a narrative. It already is a narrative. It's a narrative of nation. It's a myth of nation formation. It's a modern myth in so many ways, and I wanted to retell it in a more textured fashion.
Yeah, because of course you then get to at least try to make sense of what that figure is, who he is in this particular time, and not just the way in which we might project him in the contemporary, or you might use him. And certainly, I think you're absolutely right. The narrative, this sort of wider life lived, gives you a sense of how that is. That's sort of placed alongside that myth. I mean, I can imagine that when you were first decided to write on Dara, and maybe you had a conversation with someone in India about this, I wonder what the response might have been. I can imagine people probably asked you, why are you writing this book?
Interestingly, not so much when I began the book, and the book has its seeds in my doctoral dissertation, but it isn't my doctoral dissertation.
Yeah,
because that was sort of in a more conventional dissertation format, and I wrote this as a narrative, bringing in the political history, including all kinds of other figures and characters. But interestingly, Dara Shukoh has had a bit of a revival ever since I finished the manuscript of the book.
Right.
So for years, Dara Shukoh was the icon of what one might the secular liberals of India. If one can attach such people to people. So he was the sorts of people who might find the iconoclastic poetry of Kabir attractive, who like the idea of religious harmony, who might find discomfort with ideas, certain kinds of religious orthodoxy, and so on, are attracted to Dara Shukoh and have sought to revive him through literary works, theatre, just invoking him, and so on. But in the last couple of years, Dara Shukoh has been seized upon by the RSS, by various figures in the Sangh Parivar.
Right.
So he's had a little Hindu nationalist revival, but the story is a bit complicated. Because on the one hand, those who advocate, who hold seminars on Dara Shukoh, they've been like numerous conferences and seminars, not really necessarily featuring Mughal studies experts or Dara Shukoh experts, but various politicians and religious leaders pontificating. And at occasions, Indian Muslims are sort of addressed with this kind of narrative that, why do you valorize Aurangzeb? You really ought to be more like Dara Shukoh. And yet that's a really impossible bind, because they can never sort of truly be assimilated into the Hindu Rashtra.
Yeah, because the question of belonging is a lot more complicated than that. But I mean, in that sort of presentation by the Hindu nationalists of Dara, what is being stressed? Is it the fact that here you have a figure who is perhaps being authentic to his Indic location? So his interest in Indic learning in these, for example, the Upanishads, is an expression of his authentic Indianness? Is that what they mean by that? Why are they in particular?
Yeah, right. Because in Savarkar's sort of famous formulation, Indian Muslims do not consider India to be their holy land as well as their fatherland.
Yeah.
And that Dara Shukoh might have done that to a slightly greater extent. Of course, one redeeming feature of Dara Shukoh is that he never got to be emperor. He never got to be ruler. He was killed. That makes it all the more easy to valorize him.
Sure.
But okay, so I just saw a question about, doesn't this bring us to the great man tradition?
That's Nandini.
That's Nandini.
Yeah, my colleague at Exeter, Nandini Chatterjee. Yeah.
Right. So is the question sort of does the biography genre bring us to the great tradition of history? Just the very choice of focusing on a figure like Dara Shukoh, or analyzing the narratives around Dara Shukoh, which are very, very, very much rooted in this idea of the great man tradition of history. So I would say that narratives that place Mughal emperors at the center absolutely speak to this idea of this great man tradition that we've had, that was certainly articulated very strongly during colonial times, where the emperor somehow sort of reflected the character of the age. And that's a narrative that I was very much uncomfortable with.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I took it as a kind of challenge to work on Dara Shukoh, as someone looking at a writer, as a thinker, while also placing him again in conversation with a greater backdrop of his times. So in a sense, I'm not, I didn't want to try to presume I could ascertain his inner thoughts and motivations. But in many cases, one of my aims was really to decenter Dara Shukoh. The narrative that has Dara Shukoh as this misfit, as this outsider, kind of this solitary figure in his ivory tower, is one that's sort of linked to this great man narrative. But when you actually place Dara Shukoh in a wider conversation with people who really aren't that famous, like whether it's Abdur Rahman Chishti, the Chishti Sufi who translated the Gita and wrote all kinds of other sort of works, or Sufi Sharif, this sort of shadowy figure who seems to have been a Mansabdar who translated many brief soteriological Indic texts into Persian, or Banwali Das Wali, Dara Shukoh's sort of employee and protege, who did a lot to popularize ideas of sort of Vedanta after Dara Shukoh's death. So there are many lesser known figures with whom Dara was in conversation. That was part of my aim. One key figure in this story is Dara Shukoh's sister, right. Jahanara.
Yeah.
And she's of course often treated as a figure in her own right. And I discovered when working on this biography that her story and her spiritual and intellectual trajectory was just so closely linked to that of Dara Shukoh. They finished their first book on exactly the same day, the 27th of Ramzan, which is an auspicious day that Dara Shukoh he liked to end his to complete his books on. And it seems that one can retrace their travels, and through Jahanara's autobiography, you can see that they were discussing things. They were reading Sufi tazkiras. They were exchanging books between themselves. She was, reading in her palanquin, reading as she traveled on her incessantly peripatetic life, where she really never left her father and often her younger brother. So, uh, so from whatever I could reconstruct from the relation of the relationship between these siblings,
Mm.
one finds that Jahan has this really prominent place, and that her intellectual trajectory goes hand in hand with that of Dara Shukoh.
Um, there's a question about the date, but let me just ask you one quick thing on that. Uh, so Jahanara was slightly older, if I remember correctly, right? So,
Yeah.
um, I mean, in what sense do you think she might actually have been quite an important influence on her brother? I mean, did she take up the
Yeah.
Sufi path before him? Was it around the same time, or uh, you know, I guess it's quite difficult to tell. Does Dara in any place mention a possible influence of his sister?
No, he doesn't.
Yeah.
She talks about him. She talks about him with great respect. She makes it seem as though he is her spiritual mentor, and he is also facilitating her own correspondence and relationship with various prominent Sufis.
Right.
Maybe she's being overly modest in how she portrays this. It's very, and then of course we have this unofficial narrative of the imperial family's relationship
Hmm.
with the Qadiri Sufi order of Mia Mir and Shah by Tawakkul Beg. And this narrative gives us a really fascinating perspective. uh, it can't just be sort of put down to sort of Sufi polemics trying to make the Sufi, to elevate the Sufi above the emperor. We have
Hmm.
this intimate glimpse here of the imperial household and of the way in which Shah Jahan, Dara Shukoh, and Jahanara are just constantly traveling, developing the relationship with a Sufi who is initially aloof and then becomes folded into the imperial household.
I mean, it's interesting also because I mean this relationship between the Sufi and the Sultan, um, which of course has been a concern of Mughal history for quite a while, but especially if you think about, for example, Asfar Moin's work, right, and his particular way in which he presents a Mughal kingship. Um, and that could potentially explain, the point you made about Dara wanting to finish his books on the 27th of Ramadan because auspicious, and it's sort of a portent for what is to come, and his role in the unfolding of history. Um, but it's also maybe helps us to understand, for example, why Jahanara might have been deferential to her younger brother, quite simply because she knew that it was he who was going to be this millennial sovereign and not her. Um, and maybe that's also one way in which we can diffuse an element of the Dara versus Aurangzeb versus the other brothers. Potentially all of them were kings, and potentially all of them had this sort of notion of kingship at the back of their minds. Regardless of whether one's talking about an association with a particular religious tendency or not.
Absolutely. They were all potential kings. Uh, and we have, of course, we have the most evidence of the relationship between Jahanara and Dara, as well as Jahanara and Aurangzeb. Of course, these are letters found in the later collection, the Adab Alamgiri. But we have 16 letters that Aurangzeb writes his sister. We don't have her replies.
Right.
But this also belies the fact that she only developed a relationship with Dara.
Yeah.
She was there's a kind of so with in the case of Dara Shukoh, it's a bit more than kind of just sort of pragmatic strategy. It's I think this type of uh, spiritual self-fashioning is one that Shah Jahan is also participating in. There again, this unofficial chronicle has a lot of letters that he writes Mullah Shah. In fact, he's often meeting these Sufis when Dara Shukoh is engaged in a whole lot of other things, and starts branching out his interests and his spiritual teachers.
Right. Yeah, no, that's very interesting. We had this fairly strange question which came in, although maybe you know the response is whether there is a good film biopic of Dara Shukoh out there. I'm not familiar with any, but I'm not familiar with any portrayals of Dara on film. Are you familiar with any?
I mean, there is this big blockbuster called Takht that's coming up. I
Oh,
think
okay.
with 19, but so there is supposed to be one. If I do recommend that you read my book before you watch Takht, and then see what you think.
Okay, yeah. No, I mean that's interesting. So is that film going to be specifically about him, or is it going to be about the War of Succession?
I think it's going to be about the War of Succession. It's hard to say. I mean, it's the two brothers, the opposition between the two
Yeah.
brothers.
So which is obviously why it would be of interest to people in contemporary South Asia.
Yes, yes.
Because in and of itself, you'd think, I mean, there have been many sort of wars of conflicts of succession in the Mughals and in other dynasties in that period. So of course, why focus on this particular one? Yeah, so Rana Safavi is just confirmed it's about Dara versus Aurangzeb. Um, can I mean, since we've raised this whole question of literature, can you give us maybe some other examples of how Dara plays out in South Asian literature, which you feel that your book can speak to?
So, of course, there are the contemporary narratives about Dara Shukoh that are well known, and that are being further articulated under this present government. There's a kind of search for Dara Shukoh's tombstone as well, which is going to be an interesting project if it ever happens after the virus crisis. But there's also a whole history of the reception of Dara Shukoh that isn't particularly well known.
Right.
And this is the reception of Dara Shukoh after his death.
Hmm.
When you would assume that Aurangzeb was successful in stamping out everything associated with his brother, getting his name effaced from manuscripts that were in the imperial library and so on. But his writings continued to circulate.
Yeah.
And one can't have a total complete picture of the reception. But in about 80 manuscripts that I've found details of his Upanishad translation, for instance, you get the sense that these were elite Hindus. Some were Brahmins, some were of the other castes that were really coming into their own, Kayas, Khatris, and so on. Castes that enjoyed employment in the Mughal administration. And these are people who were reading and circulating Upanishad translations. So Persian was the main literary language of these Hindus. And Dara Shukoh's choice of selecting these Upanishads as emblematic of the sacred texts of Indians, that monotheistic sacred texts, choosing and anthologizing these selected Upanishads played an important role in, I think, the textualization of Hindu knowledge among certain influential communities.
And I think that's a very important point, quite simply because we sometimes forget how Persian really was an Indian language, which was an elite language used by all sorts of communities and peoples. And so it's not necessarily surprising that you'd have Hindu intellectuals who would be using Persian as the way in which they would engage with, write about their own faith.
Absolutely. And in many cases, translators, copyists, and so on do point out that it's this is the way in which many Hindus can have access to these texts. And in the case of works that were composed in Sanskrit and that didn't really have a wide circulation beyond certain Brahmin communities, this was a way of making these texts accessible to non-Brahmins as well.
Right. Yeah. So it's a. So there's a question here. Was Ram Mohan Roy's Tofat directly
Influenced
influenced by Dara?
Well, so the connection between Ram Mohan Roy and his Persian writings and a figure like Dara Shukoh is something that I've been really interested in. So, so I think there's definitely a thread that one can draw from Dara Shukoh kind of through the 18th century, sort of well into the 19th century. So it's a thread that we can draw from Dara Shukoh to these 19th century articulations of Hinduism as a religion. So there are different ways in which Ram Mohan Roy was informed by, if not Dara Shukoh's project specifically, the effects of this project, of the Mughal project, of elevating Vedanta, choosing certain texts to translate, and developing this vocabulary, this Persian vocabulary of universal religion.
Right.
So after Dara Shukoh, there were many writers, including many Hindus, who were clearly reading and being influenced by Dara Shukoh, and by this language of universalism, with which they inflected their translations or renditions of Indic works into Persian. And these writings circulated.
Right.
So Ram Mohan Roy is drawing on this broader legacy of Hindu writing in Persian that is influenced by and in dialogue with Mughal Indology. And so I also have a hunch about another interlocutor that was closer to Ram Mohan Roy's times. And this is something that, coincidentally, Carl Ernst has also pointed out, and it's something I'd like to take up further, but I can't say too much about that, because I'm really at the beginning of sort of this project. But yes, there was a Hindu sort of literature and writer of Persian in Benares, whom I think Ram Mohan Roy might have encountered, and there are great influences between his own writing and Ram Mohan Roy's Tofat.
Right. I mean, that sort of potentially leads, maybe to discussing your current and future projects. But let me just, I mean, before we get that, I just want to know a bit more about the legacy of Dara amongst sort of Muslim elites, because you've spoken, I think, very significantly about how his work was taken up by Hindu elites in particular, and in how they conceived of religion. But what about the Muslim reception? Was it mainly amongst Sufis, or was it broader than that? I mean, what sort of Muslim intellectuals, for example, might have been reading the Sirr-e Akbar in the 18th century?
So that's a great question, and I found less I don't want to say that they weren't reading it. I found less evidence that Muslim intellectuals were reading the Sirr-e Akbar in the 18th century. But that it's also about maybe the domains of knowledge that were gaining, increasing in importance, and sort of what kinds of knowledge was flourishing in the 18th century. Sort of a lot of Arabic, a lot of Hadith studies, a lot of lexicography, a lot of philosophy. there were Sufis reading, quite a few Sufis reading the Majmu al-Bahrain. That seems, and this is just something we tell from manuscript, authorship, scribal information, ownership, and so on, marginal notes. So I've gotten a sense that there were quite a few. There are Qadri networks, that kind of stretched quite far. That also, there are Arabic translations and so on. So Dara Shukoh's writings did circulate.
So there are Arabic
you don't
translations of which works? Of the Majmu al-Bahrain?
Arabic translation, yeah.
Right. And when was that done?
Yeah, I'm blanking a little bit on it. I've like studied the manuscript and written all about it in my book, and I'm just blanking.
I'm just interested in who it was done for and where it traveled, because I mean we know from Carl Ernst's work on the yoga texts that they get translated from Persian, the 16th century Persian versions, and end up being used by Sufis in North Africa in the Arabic versions.
Yes, absolutely. Yoga, and that tends to happen with yoga texts. Again, kind of these technologies of the self, do have a very wide reach.
Yeah.
So one sees that with yoga texts, and of course, there are Qadri communities that are copying and transmitting Dara Shukoh's Sufi works.
Yeah. No, but it'd just be interesting if in particular those stuff which is very much focused on Vedanta. I mean, I'm at the moment, I've been collaborating with a friend on a text which we're not entirely sure when it was written, but the earliest manuscript is 1709. And it's written by an Iranian Sufi who is in India. And there's a whole section, I mean, the text is actually interspersed with concepts from Vedanta, which are transcribed. So these are Sanskrit terms transcribed into Arabic. And I've been wondering what the source is. But towards the end of the work, there's a whole section on, the Lataif theory of the subtle substances and the levels of the soul. And that is absolutely full of terms which are taken directly from yoga and from Vedantic texts. And he hasn't translated them. He's literally just transliterated them into Arabic. So that's quite interesting that you find that. But that text is still primarily circulating in India, and maybe to a certain extent in Iran, but not beyond that.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of cross-pollination when it comes to things like that. In fact, one of the texts that I'm looking at for my current project is indeed it's a text on breath divination, and it's a very loose translation of a Hindi text by the author's guru at the time, and it's called Muhit Marifat, and it really it sort of seamlessly folds in, these concepts, various concepts of Hatha Yoga, for instance, with kind of Persian mysticism and other Islamic concepts.
I mean, some of this prevalence of yoga in particular, it's kind of coupling with Vedanta. It makes me wonder whether, as you know, and David Gordon White has suggested that what we understand of the yoga tradition nowadays is very much a creation of the British colonial kind of enterprise of the exoticization. But it seems to me that Yoga Vedanta might actually be better described as a something which really emerges out of, as you put it, Mughal Indology.
Yeah, well, so yes, and there you can see the Vedanticization of yoga, taking place. So even outside that, in the broader context. So this, the Sant Charan Das, this devotional figure with a amongst the merchant castes of North India, also translates 5 Upanishads into Hindi.
Right.
Yeah. And you don't really hear of translations before Dara Shukoh, but after Dara Shukoh, you hear of translations sponsored by the Sikh Darbar. You hear of various other Hindi translations of the Upanishads, and he writes on yoga, and you really see kind of this connection between Vedanta and yoga in his works.
Cool. So I guess we should then talk about your current project. What have you been working on since, as you said, you did finish this book a while ago. So what is your current project?
Well, so my current project, which is right now kind of not moving on along as swiftly as I would wish.
Well, it's not surprising. It's a difficult time for everyone. I don't think you should necessarily worry about the slow pace at the moment.
Yes, it's a slow piece, but it's one that when I manage to escape into these texts, it's one that brings me a lot of comfort because these are texts that were also written at a time of great crisis. All these invasions, sacks of Delhi and invasions of North India. So while it's a time of political turmoil and great cultural flourishing. So texts like the Mohita Marifat, which is sort of how I'm beginning this book, really speak to this focus on the self, this focus on kind of cultivating and refining the self in dialogue with what was going on in poetry, music, and so on during this period. And it's a way also of creating vocabulary of universalism that draws on this tradition of Mughal Indology. There are other kind of sort of early modern trends that are taking place. This idea of this that gathering knowledge, encyclopedism, for instance, where we see forms of knowledge production that are similar to some of the Persian texts that were produced under colonial patronage. So this period is the beginning of my work, and it's sort of in some senses it's like a kind of intellectual history sequel to the work on Dara Shukoh, because it shows how the circulation and reception of Mughal Indology in the 18th and 19th centuries is a very important strand of how Hinduism came to be a religion.
Okay, that sounds fascinating. It certainly isn't something which I've seen people work on. But I think also that you mentioned this kind of stress upon the self and the cultivation of the self, and I'm interested in that because I think I'm doing a bit of work. Hopefully, we should be getting this special issue out with Prashant Keshavmurthy at McGill, and we're looking very much at Bedil. And one of the reasons why we focused on Bedil is that we thought that there was something of interest in terms of this emergence of a concept of the self in someone like Bedil, which of course draws on both Indic sources and very much sources within the school of Ibn Arabi, Sufi sources, but potentially constitutes a rather interesting alternative trajectory to selfhood, to the sort of standard European narrative that we have, right? So, we have lots of accounts of the rise of selfhood and the individual, which are very Eurocentric. And so we're perhaps slightly polemically counterposing Bedil into that equation to look at this notion of selfhood. And I think that late 17th and then 18th century context is absolutely key to that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I look forward to learning from this project.
And in terms of the work, so you said you're primarily working on texts in the 18th century, but you said you're starting with it as a beginning. Is it just in the 18th century, or does it go further than the 18th century?
Oh, it goes well into the 19th century because once you have print, you have loads of Persian material that's circulating, and you have all these Hindus who are reading and writing in Persian, and many of whom trained in Persian to get colonial employment.
Of course.
And then, they were a bit late. So even as Persian started to wane as the official language of governance, Persian print culture sort of took off, and when that waned, it was Urdu. One of the figures whom I study is interesting in so many ways. A figure called Kanhaiya Lal Alakdari, who was a tireless Hindu reformer in the 19th, and he was partly responsible for bringing the Arya Samaj into Punjab. He traveled. He was a prolific writer, and he translated Dara Shukoh's Upanishads as well as Dara Shukoh's Yoga Vasishtha translation made for Dara Shukoh. And he really views Dara Shukoh as someone who was almost like a sort of Protestant figure. He very explicitly compares Hindus with Muslims and Christians, and he says Muslims and Christians translate their holy books, and we really need to translate our holy books because we can't read Sanskrit, and he wasn't a Brahmin. So he got this. So he translates Dara Shukoh's writings into Urdu in order to produce sacred texts that Hindus can read and circulate and use for pedagogical purposes, and these go into multiple printings.
And that, that again brings us to that brings us again to another theme which I was discussing with Ali Khan just a week or so ago, which is about how the nature of Urdu and what sort of language is it within Indian context, and how it seems to have suddenly become much more like the Dara versus Aurangzeb. Urdu has also become a question of, is it this ideal secular language, or is it just a language for Muslims? So it's one forgets that it, of course, is not just a vernacular in South Asia, but it could, of course, be used by other religious traditions as well. As Muslim ones.
Right, absolutely. And especially in the
Cool. Well, I think that's been really, really interesting, and I definitely look forward to seeing your 18th century book, because, as you know, it's an area that I'm very much interested in as well, and I'm probably as much of a manuscript or book geek as you are when it comes to these sorts of things. Is there anything, final thing you'd like to say, or anything you want to sort of wrap things up with in terms of your current work?
Not so much, Well, I think so. So part of what I'm doing in this current work is producing perhaps rather subversive genealogy of Hindu nationalism, because you can actually trace thread from Dara Shukoh through to various 18th century figures, to Ram Mohan Roy, to figures like Dari, who didn't particularly like at all. And someone like Shraddha Ram Philori, those who are advocating a kind of Sanatan Dharma, this idea that they popularized in the 19th century of this kind of Hinduism as this eternal, sort of universalistic religion. So though these projects are quite the same as Savarkar's project, what's commonly termed as Neo-Vedanta, kind of universalistic ideas of Hinduism, did lay some of the intellectual foundations for Hindu nationalism, and they also had, they emerged in dialogue with these Mughal intellectual projects.
No, that's sort of, I think that's absolutely fascinating, and it also very interestingly links into something I was thinking about recently, which is the way in which Dara Shukoh, but also this kind of Mughal Indology is used by those who are called traditionalists in the 20th century. So whether that's people like
Yes,
Rene Guénon and Kumaraswamy, or even people like Darius Shairan, right? Um,
yes,
so it's quite interesting that kind of trajectory and that influence, and of course Darius Shairan, of course, famously edited and translated the Majma al-Bahrain as well. Um,
he did. I
so
think he
it's,
very kindly gave
I mean, that
us.
kind of that trajectory is also an interesting one, and where if there are vestiges of that Mughal indulge actually within Persian literature and Iranian culture today, that's another kind of interesting story which potentially could be told.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Cool. Well,
Yeah.
thank you again, Supriya, for this conversation. I hope that, well, if people have further comments to make, they can make on this, and I will be uploading a copy of this video on our YouTube channel so people can follow up there as well. I very much look forward to reading your new book and learning much from it. Thank you for your time. And thank you to everyone who has been watching this. Just to say that our remaining conversations this week, it just seems to have turned out to be a bit of a South Asian themed week because we have Norman Naqvi tomorrow at the same time at 4 o'clock, and we'll be talking about decolonization and particularly working towards a reparative curriculum. And then we will also have um, Neha Vermani at the end of the week, and there's the fourth one I'm forgetting right now. But anyway, we've got 4 talks which are very, or 4 conversations which I think will be of much interest to people who have tuned in. So thank you for watching, and once again, Supriya, thank you for your time, and
That's great.
hope to
Yeah.
see
Well,
you in better times soon in the normal world, maybe, inshallah.
hope so too.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks. Cheers. Bye now.
आज के दस्तरखान रमज़ान में मैं आप सब का तहे दिल से इस्तकबाल करती हूँ। तो बच्चों, आपका रोज़ा आज कैसा